My name is Nicholas McDougall and I'm one of the local historians that have contributed to this virtual tour of the Mackay Cemetery. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which this tour is being held, the Yuwi Burra and the Yuwi Biri people, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Cemetery inscriptions have always fascinated people. They are usually filled with a brief summary of the lives of those who have come before us. These inscriptions are in terms of the beginnings and ends, but usually with very little information in between. This virtual cemetery tour will guide you through some of Mackay's early settlers and share with you their stories. A little about the Mackay Cemetery before we get started. The cemetery is believed to have been on this site as early as 1868, though it was not Mackay's original burial ground. The 1863 town survey indicates an 8-acre cemetery was to be located beside the Pioneer River, on the ground situated between today's Chain and Endeavour Streets, but it is not known if this area was ever actually used for burials. Some tales from locals tell of stories that coffins and those inside were seen floating down the Pioneer River from the cemetery beside the riverbank during a flood event. The idea of a tranquil cemetery overlooking the beautiful river scenery sounds lovely, but may have proven to be a not so ideal location. The second known burial ground for Mackay was on the eastern side of Byron Street, between now Gordon and Park Streets. Byron Street was at the time the outer edge of the township. This site also proved to be located on a flood-prone area. As the first two cemeteries for Mackay proved to be in unsuitable locations, the Mackay Cemetery was gazetted on high ground, 2.5 kilometres from the settlement along the Nebo track as it was then known. Soon after the inception of the Mackay Municipal Council in 1869, preliminary steps were taken to fence the cemetery and establish a system of management. The early fees that were adopted were £1 5 shillings for an adult burial and 12 shillings 6 pence for a child's burial, and double on Sundays. Streets in Mackay have been named after people included on this virtual tour, so let us jump in and learn about the faces behind the places. Gustaf Muller. A diary telling the story of his adventurous and hard-working life was one of the legacies left to Mackay by this German migrant, Gustaf Adolf Muller, who was born on the 31st of May 1842 in a province of Germany. Gustaf left Hamburg in November 1863 and arrived in Brisbane in May 1864. He boarded the steamer Clarence and travelled to Rockhampton and then to Peakdown Station, but finding there was no work, he went to Cotherton Station near Claremont, where he obtained work with Charles Walker, the manager of the station. In 1868, he made his way to Mackay with Charles Walker and the Walker family. Gustaf and John Spiller fell out over a job he had done for Spiller, so Gustaf decided to return to Germany. He left Brisbane at the end of March 1869. After a few months with his family in Germany, he travelled to Scotland and boarded the Britannia, bound for New York. From here he travelled to Baltimore in Maryland and worked at a foundry for $9 per week. He then operated his own business. Gustaf's first marriage was in Baltimore to Maria Katerina Illich in 1870. Maria was an immigrant from Helsfeld in Germany. Their first two children, Anna and Ernest, were born in America, but feeling that Australia held their destiny, Gustaf set sail with his young family, returning via Liverpool, London and Plymouth, with a visit in between to Germany for Christmas 1879. They arrived in Sydney during the first week of May 1877. Answering an advertisement for workers in Mackay, Gustaf was engaged to work at the Plaistow Mill. Another daughter, Emily, was born in September 1881. Gustaf's main reason for returning to Australia was to take up land. He became a naturalised citizen in November 1879 and acquired land in the Eaton district in 1882 at Hilldale, where he planted crops of maize and potatoes. A daughter, Elizabeth, was born in September 1883. Unfortunately, his wife Maria died during childbirth and she is buried at Hilldale. Gustaf then married Margaret Menzies on the 31st of March 1884. Margaret was born in Edinburgh in 1858. Margaret had come to Australia in September 1883. Margaret and Gustaf had one child, Margaret Ellen, known as Nell, in February 1886. Margaret died just 5 months after the birth of their daughter. She is buried here in the Mackay Cemetery. Gustaf's third marriage in February 1887 was to Adelaide Pitkin, who had immigrated with her brother, the engineer for the Barry Mill at Eton. Adelaide was born in London in 1865. Gustaf and Adelaide had 4 children, Henry, Agnes, and the twins Oliver and Ronald. Ronald died in January 1898. Gustaf started growing sugarcane on his land, and in 1891 he sent his first cane to the North Eton Mill to be crushed. It sold for 12 shillings a tonne. He worked the farm until he sold it in 1920. He left Hilldale in 1922 to live with his son Henry. Gustaf died in Mackay on the 17th of January 1932, aged 89, and Adelaide died in Mackay on the 14th of March 1950. Henry Bell. Just north of Sarina is Bell's Creek. It is named after one of the families that helped make Sarina the town it is today. Henry Bell was born in England before coming to Australia in 1853. As a young man, he developed a reputation as an able stockman. He walked cattle on behalf of the Atherton family from Armidale to Woodland Station near Rockhampton. On the 3rd of October 1861, Henry married Alice Atherton in Rockhampton. 2 years later, Bell took his brother-in-law Edmund Atherton into partnership, and together they proceeded further north with stock and took up the country in the district outlying the new settlement of Mackay, forming the station known as Plain Creek. Bell established a pastoral run in 1864 on the site of which eventually grew to the present town of Sarina. It is said Bell chose that name because there is a plain with a creek running through it, so let us call it Plain Creek. Bell pegged out an area 25 square miles covering an area from the coast to the mountains north to Alligator Creek and south to Yukon. The Bell family's Plain Creek homestead stood on the northeastern side of the main Sarina-Mackay Road near Bell's Creek. The house burned down in 1908, losing all the family's possessions. Henry Bell was well known for his connection with the development of the sugar industry. His personal effort and financial support were large factors in the formation of the company which established the Plain Creek Mill. Plain Creek Sugar Mill started crushing in 1896. Henry Bell served as a member of the Pioneer Shire Council and was instrumental in building the first bridge to cross Sandy Creek to link Mackay with the southern districts surrounding Sarina. He was a prominent figure in racing circles in Mackay and was the first starter of the Mackay Turf Club. Henry Bell retired in Mackay and passed away 7 years later on the 29th of January 1915. He was buried here in the family plot of the Mackay Cemetery. Andrew Henderson. Andrew Henderson holds a unique position in Mackay history as one of the first settlers of the area. He was born on the 2nd of November 1831 in Scotland and later arrived in Mackay in October 1862. Prior to his arrival in Mackay, he was an overseer at Newstead Station. His arrival in Mackay followed by the discovery by Captain John Mackay of what was to become the Pioneer River. He was to establish the first store of any kind in Mackay and later added a public house at the site. Establishing the first store in the settlement was his intention, of which he succeeded. The store was located at what was to later become the site of Marsh and Webster's store. Mr. Henderson then went on to become the managing partner of a property known as the River Estate. After this property was sold, he then farmed land in the Lagoons area, approximately 60 acres. His final business venture was to be the Beaconsfield Plantation, of which also included a sugar mill, of which the suburb of Beaconsfield is now named after. Andrew Henderson was married twice, initially to Mary Ann Elizabeth Allman in 1863 and later to Lydia Jackson in 1871. Mr. Henderson was the father to 4 daughters, Margaret, Isabel and Mary Ann, and then Lydia. Mr. Andrew Henderson passed away on September 25th, 1892 at the age of 59. He was at the time Mackay's oldest resident. Edward Mackenzie Scott. Edward Mackenzie Scott was born in Edinburgh in about 1833. the son of Charles Mackenzie Scott and Sarah Haig. He arrived in Mackay in 1868, having come overland from Rockhampton to Mackay with a mob of horses. The route taken was over the range via the Broadsound track, and he stayed at the Horse and Jockey Hotel at Racecourse, which was conducted by fellow Scot Michael McCluskey. Initially, Edward, who was a carpenter by trade, started a business in conjunction with James Mayhew and built a cottage at the Branscombe plantation for George Martin of Martin and Long. Another of their early jobs after arriving in Mackay was the erection of the Royal Hotel in Sydney Street in 1870. Subsequently, they converted George Smith's store into a public house where the Union Bank was later built. Scott and Mayhew also built the District Hospital, the Alien School and the original Customs House in 1872. Edward formed several very successful partnerships and worked in conjunction with other building contractors, including James Mayhew, Evan Davies, and in 1898, Adolphus Haskin. He became a notable builder and contractor in the region during his time in Mackay. On the 11th of June 1901, Scott and Haskin signed a contract to build the police station at Plain Creek. It included the cells, stables and furniture for the total price of £746. Post office directories in 1888 show Edward Mackenzie Scott living at Gregory Street. Edward married Emily Schrodinger on the 26th of June 1860 in Rockhampton, and they had 14 children. Edward and Emily's last born daughter Minnie married Robert Charles McGinn on the 16th of April 1917, whose family in 1926 founded the well-known firm McGinn's Engineering. Emily Scott died on the 23rd of January 1919 and Edward died on the 17th of March 1920. They are both buried here in the Mackay Cemetery. Robert Fleming. Robert Fleming was born on the 31st of January 1840 at Kilnarnrock, Ayr, Scotland, the son of George Fleming and Janet Wilson. Robert had lived in New Zealand from an early age and spent time in Rockhampton before coming to Mackay. He arrived on board the coastal steamer Murray under the command of Captain Till on the 31st of January 1863 and took up residence in Sydney Street. He was first employed in his trade as a blacksmith. It is understood by James Vosey he later commenced business on his own. Robert purchased portion 173 in Mackay at public auction of Crown land on the 31st of October 1865, being one of the several blocks that he purchased. Robert Fleming fell for the sugar boom and prospect of making money. In 1872 he purchased a tiny sugar mill which won a prize at the Sydney Agricultural Show. The mill was designed for use with a horse or bullock power, but was able to be upgraded to steam operation. He let out his blacksmith workshop to embrace his new adventures. He soon found the rewards of farming were uncertain and his ventures were short-lived. Robert never married. His obituary describes him as being well respected, of a reserved disposition who took no part in public life in Mackay. James Reedy. James Reedy was born in Ireland in December 1834. After meeting his wife Mary, the two had troubled times in Ireland. The couple decided to make a future for themselves in Australia. With James arriving in New South Wales in 1854 and Mary the following year, they were married in Sydney in April 1858 and worked for some years at Gordonbrook Station in New South Wales, where their first child Charles was born. James and Mary decided upon a new venture in the north and travelled by bullock wagon to Queensland. They assisted in transporting a mob of cattle along the way, with James in charge of the bullock wagons while Mary cooked for the men. The couple stopped at Rockhampton to obtain their last lot of supplies for the overland trek. There were only a few properties that had been formed north of there. The couple had overcome the chaotic challenge of getting the cattle and wagons over the Connors Range safely and rested at the Connors River. It is here, under a bullock wagon, that Mary gave birth to their second child, Catherine, known as Kate, in 1862. Kate was the first white child born in the Mackay district. Mary Reedy was the first white woman in the Mackay region and did not have the company of any other females until over a year later. The couple are known for being the first to drive a bullock wagon onto Mackay soil to collect supplies. The supplies were received by the cutter ship Presto, which landed the stores about 100 yards above where the hospital bridge stands today. James and Mary later worked at Greenmount Station, where their third child James was born in 1863, and then their fourth child Mary was also born in 1867. It was also while James and Mary were at Greenmount Station that the historic leap event occurred, owing to a misunderstanding and conflict between the early settlers of the area and the local Aboriginal people. The event occurred in 1867 and is shared by Yubira descendants as native mounted police coming upon a group of Yubira people at Mount Mandarana. A great number of Yubira people, including men, women and children, spread out to seek refuge in the caves and in the scrub at the top of Mount Mandarana. The native police continued their pursuit of the Yubira people and carried out their orders of dispersal by forcing many Yubira people to their deaths. Hidden by her mother and surviving the terrible leap event was an Aboriginal baby girl who was rescued by James Reedy after her mother's tragic passing. James Reedy took the baby home to his wife Mary to be raised alongside their own family. They named the child Joanna Hazeldine. Joanna was named after Mount Johannesburg, which is said to be the unofficial name of Mount Mandarana, the mountain on which the leap incident occurred, and her surname Hazeldine, which after the small locality where she was raised by the Reedies. James and Mary had Joanna baptised on the same day as their own daughter March, on the 22nd of July 1867. The Reedies later owned Fort Cooper Station, properties in Bakers Creek, Racecourse and Mackay. They also owned the Cosmopolitan Hotel, later called Malloy's, in Sydney Street, which was managed by their son Charles, a great meeting place for Irish in those days. James and Mary both passed away in Mackay, Mary in 1902 and James on the 1st of January 1909. Both are buried in the Mackay Cemetery and remembered for their huge contribution to pioneering Mackay. Andre Manuel. Andre Manuel was born on the 21st of September 1836 in Portugal. At the age of 16, Andre arrived in Sydney in 1854, having jumped off the ship Mandarin. In 1863, he arrived in Rockhampton and married his first wife, Elizabeth McKern, on the 17th of October 1864. In 1865, Andre attended the first land sale in Mackay and bought 5 acres of land on Shakespeare Street, which was the residence of well-known business owners Samuel and Esther Lambert, who operated Lambert's Proprietary Limited. Andre purchased 98 acres of land on the north side of Mackay in an area later known as Flores Estate and Greenfields, situated in North Mackay and Mount Pleasant areas. Andre grew a large variety of fruit trees, including grapes, on his land. He manufactured wine that became well known in the district, supplying the Catholic Church. On the weekends, people would come out from Mackay to the farm in their horse and buggies and pay 5 pence at the gate. They would then picnic and eat various fruits in the Manuel's orchard. They were permitted to take a bucket of fruit home. Andre is said to have moved ladders between the trees with children holding on. Andre's first wife passed away in 1870, leaving Andre to raise 3 children. He then married Catherine McVoy in 1871 and gave birth to 2 daughters. Unfortunately, Catherine died in 1877, giving birth to their unnamed child. Struck with grief, Andre reportedly advertised his 98 acres of land for sale. The reason for the sale was the owner was leaving the country. Andre eventually rethought his situation and his grief was alleviated on the 3rd of December 1878. Andre married for the 3rd time. His bride was Mary O'Loughlin, giving Andre another 6 children and raising 10 all told. Andre died on the 18th of December 1915. Age 77. He is buried in the Mackay Cemetery. Andre was described by his family as being a quiet and deeply religious man who often recited his rosary in Portuguese. On top of his headstone are grapes symbolising his career as a winemaker in the Mackay district. John Hani. John Hani was born in 1841 He was one of the first pioneers of the Mackay district, having arrived in 1868. He was a gentleman who was for many years associated with the progress of this place. He was, for a considerable period, a member of the municipal council and was elected mayor of Mackay. In 1885, Mr. Hani was interested in all aspects of Mackay living. He was part of the local council, in a number of social circles, and also a serving member on a number of public bodies. Mr. Hani took up residence at his property near Plain Creek, where he became a member of the Pioneer Divisional Board, a proof that in later years he was by no means inclined to retire from duties of taking part in local public affairs. In John's public capacity, he made few, if any, enemies, his gentle temperament causing his strongest opponents to feel friendly towards him while differing from him on points of public policy. Privately, he was esteemed by large circles of friends and acquaintances. John Hani was also known in the community for trying to keep St. Joseph's Orphanage from moving from Seaview, now Mackay, to Rockhampton. He was unsuccessful in his endeavours, but was remembered for his efforts. John Hani went on to marry Johanna O'Regan, known as Annie, in August 1864. John and Annie had 5 children: John, Patrick, Eleanor, known as Nell, Maurice, and Edward Farley. Mr. John Hani passed away in 1889, aged 49 years, surrounded by family. He was buried here in the Mackay Cemetery. The Character and Heritage Advisory Committee, Mackay Family History Society and Mackay Regional Council's Heritage Collection and staff, as well as many of the fantastic local historians, are acknowledged for their compilation of this virtual tour. If you'd like to learn more about the history and heritage of our region, please visit the Mackay Family History Society located in the Old Town Hall on Sydney Street, or visit Mackay Regional Council's Heritage Collection located in the Dudley Denny City Library on Victoria Street.